Welcome to the league with your host, Benoit Thanjan. You might know me as the Solar Maverick, and David Magid from YSG Solar. You give us 5 minutes, and we give you the latest clean energy trends. Today is July 10th, 2026, and for today's episode, I want to share a few key takeaways from the Solar Energy Industry Association's Finance and Tax and Buyers Seminar, which happened recently. It took place on Tuesday, June 23rd and Wednesday, June 24th in New York City. I've been attending this conference for a few years. I actually interviewed the former head of SIA, Abby Hopper, at the last finance forum before the big beautiful bill came out last year. The first big takeaway is that the clean energy industry remains in a very strong position, but execution is becoming more important than ever. We've spoken about this on the Solar Maverick podcast in the league. Across the panels that were speaking, the message was clear. Solar storage and other clean energy technologies consider and continue to offer what customers, policymakers, and communities need right now: affordable power, fast deployment, reliability, and environmental benefits. That matters because energy affordability is becoming a major political and economic issue. We've seen in the presidential election with President Trump, the current New York City mayor, Mayor Mamdani, and the gubernatorial election in New Jersey with Governor Mikey Sherrill, that affordability is something that politicians have focused on to win their elections. Demand for power, as we know, is growing from utilities, data centers, manufacturing, electrification, but at the same time, solar and storage remain among the fastest resources that can be deployed to meet that demand. But there's still major bottlenecks, and we've talked about this before: permitting delays, interconnection challenges, transmission constraints, local oppositions in townships, supply chain questions, and tax guidance uncertainty are all slowing down projects. One of the panels during the SIA tax seminar noted that about 15% of U.S. counties have imposed solar or storage limits, and that affects roughly 20% of U.S. land, which shows how important like local engagement has become. You really have to, if you're a developer of projects, get involved in the community early and build that consensus for your project. The second big takeaway is that policy certainty and capital formation are still driving the market. Treasury guidance remains critical, especially around prohibited foreign entity of concern rules, material assistance, safe harboring, heat tax credits. What we're finding is that investors, developers, and tax credit buyers need clarity so they could finance projects, manage compliance risk, and keep capital moving. At the same time, the tax credit market continues to mature. We heard about strong activity from tax equity banks, new market entrants, transferability structure, and large clean energy tax credit transactions. Traditional banks like Barclays are returning to the market, and large deals with institutions like JP Morgan, Capital One, and others show that investor appetite remains strong. Another encouraging point is the continued investment in domestic manufacturing. One panel highlighted roughly 40 billion of manufacturing investment over 3 years across about 100 companies, which is a major signal that the clean energy supply chain is becoming more domestic, resilient, and strategically important. So the broad takeaway of this is that clean energy has the demand, the technology, the cost advantage, and the capital. The next phase of growth will depend on faster permitting, clearer tax rules, stronger transmission, better community engagement, and bipartisan policy stability. This industry has tremendous momentum, but the winners will be the companies that can execute through this complexity that we're experiencing right now. And that's that.
Benoit, always great information, hearing with what's going on with these foreign entities as well as the tax credit market, and always positive to hear the resilience, of what you're seeing in the marketplace here.
Yeah, as we've seen in the solar coaster, and both of us have now been over a decade in the energy space, it's the companies that are able to adapt and, you know, with the new paradigms that are going to survive, and the energy transition's just starting.
Exactly. And such a great segue into the first topic that I'll be discussing is let's go to ISO New England. ISO New England transition cluster study. The results were just recently released. This is the first cluster study coming out of FERC 2023 order that is actually being displaced, within the ISO New England. There was not, the best feedback coming from the marketplace. Just to zoom out, we had 4.8 gigawatts of capacity that was studied. Out of this 4.8 gigawatts, that was studied, there was approximately 3.2 billion worth of upgrades, which is a huge number for anyone who's paying attention. About 2.5 billion were allocated strictly to those system network upgrades. These system network upgrades come out to approximately $660,000 per megawatt, for the upgrade. Now what's occurring is within the next 30 days, so we're looking at early August, is these LGIAs, these interconnection agreements are going to be tendered. There's a very short duration of time for developers to actually accept these study results, validate them, and start executing their agreements. So it's an extremely short window of time with a lot of large projects. And really what this is highlighting is the deliverability, and the challenges within the infrastructure, and really looking at the different markets. We can look at, markets, such as ERCOT, where you do not have this deliverability, and essentially it's, first come, first serve, and you're not able to buy these firm rights, where now people are starting to take a second look because of the significant cost challenges, coming out of this. So we're fascinated to see what occurs. There is a lot of huge penalties for withdrawing your project in short windows of time. So if you're operating this market, you better move quick. And there comes a lot of challenges with ISO New England, but at the same time, tons of opportunity when it comes to that capacity market and the winters and the constraints on natural gas and everything in there. So, optimize your projects. Really fascinating to see the results. A lot of folks were not happy, seeing their interconnection, upgrade costs. Remains to be seen. There's a lot of talk about these studies, actually being flawed the way that it was done. So let's see what happens and see how this plays out. Next interesting topic is going to the nuclear development, of nuclear projects that are under development. One interesting trend, that we're really seeing is a lot of the projects that are currently under development are really clustered in some very, interesting areas. You're looking at the Southeast, as a big corridor, for these projects. Texas, without a doubt, that's pretty obvious. Pennsylvania, as well, another market kind of tied in, Pennsylvania, Ohio, with these, data center types of developments. And what we're really starting to see is a lot of these projects are being developed. These are not greenfield developments. These projects are being focused on either retired, coal plant facilities, large industry areas, that are brownfields that are really being repurposed, for these types of developments that have access, to water, access to high infrastructure, and really, have a precedent of being able to get these projects permitted. As you can imagine, a lot of attention is over in the TVA market. So remains to be seen. Seeing a lot of stuff in the queue. These projects take a very long time, so we'll keep you posted, as we see these, being developed and see these being operated. Some of these trends. You just enjoyed 5 minutes of the absolute best information in the clean tech sector. Make sure you hit like, subscribe, and that's that.